Hello YouTube, just come back from a shopping trip and I stopped on Gormans Road, Eureka to start this video, just to show you that the flowering that I showed you in my last video is not in any way unique to my farm. I've had a little drive around to and from the shops here while I've been up here on my latest trip, and I've found orchards near Alstonville, Rouse, Tregeagle, Eureka, Pierces Creek. Doesn't matter where you go, 90% of the orchards I've seen have got flower, the likes of which you see here in this tree. Now, this orchard has been reasonably well maintained with pruning, you can tell, but there's another reason I stopped here as well, and that is the row to the right of this. See this? This is an example of the replanting method that I want to pursue at Nutkin Farm. What's happened here is that there's been a process of removal of trees, and there have been 2 rows of trees removed here and 1 planted down the middle, and that is an example of a new row of trees, plenty of sun, growing very happily. Probably, well, it doesn't look like they're flowering at all yet because they're still in that growth phase. So it's probably, oh no, there's a few flowers there. So I don't know what variety that would be, but you can see, and it's been repeated up and down the rows a bit further, that there've been 2 rows removed, 1 new row replanted, and it looks like the remaining rows are being kept because they're being pruned. But an absolutely lovely example of a replanting plan that I recommend over and above pulling out every second row, because when you pull out every second row, you've still got old trees remaining and you've got probably an excessively wide row spacing. But here it looks like the farmer's gone from 7 by 4, which is those 2 rows there, to about 10.5 by 4 once you've planted the new row. And of course the new row will hopefully be a variety that is better performing and easier to keep under control height-wise than the ones it replaced. Now, back to Nutkin Farm. And here we are, back on the farm. You're looking at the paddock that I showed in episode 6 of the Macadamia show, which at the time was just all stubble, but is now turning into a lovely, pretty green field. And that's quite a nice view. The row removal that I showed you in that earlier segment is something unfortunately I won't be doing this year, because my neighbour and I got together, looked at our trees that we were going to remove and saw that there was such a bumper year of flowering that we'd get one more crop out of these hoary old trees before we pulled them down, and so we've decided to do the row removal next season. That's left me free to plan the planting of this block. And I've chosen variety R, at least for the first little planting of trees. I'm not going to plant the whole block at once, but variety R is a good late dropping variety. I had to pick a pollinizer to go with it because, they all benefit from cross-pollination. And I'm thinking outside the box. I've chosen variety 783. It's like 246, which is its parent, flowers heavily over a long period of time and is very good for pollinating. But unlike 246, it drops its nuts late, just like variety R. So it makes more sense to use 783 for pollinizing the new late dropping varieties than it would for 246, which will just drop by itself early in the season and cause a management issue for harvesting. And so I'm excited. I need to get those trees from different sources, but I think if I can get them, this will be an interesting experiment, because really no one's using 783 in New South Wales at the moment. It's always a heavy cropper, but people rejected it owing to its late dropping nature. But now, as we've discussed in some recent videos, that's a good thing all of a sudden. Anyway, being an amateur YouTuber, I didn't realise that there's a channel discussion thread, which is something where people can post comments on no video in particular, just in the channel. And there's one comment there from a guy called Sam Rosehill, who asked for a discussion of plant variety rights or plant breeders' rights, the legalities of those and how they apply to macadamia farmers. And being a barrister in my other job, I suppose I'm uniquely placed to advise about that sort of thing, although I'm no intellectual property expert. And when I did law, there was a Plant Varieties Rights Act from 1987, but then that was replaced after I'd finished studying in 1994 with the Plant Breeders Rights Act. So I went back and did some research and had a look at, what was happening and which macadamia varieties actually were covered by plant breeders' rights. So, at the risk of boring you, here is a brief rundown. Plant breeders' rights are essentially the same thing as a patent or copyright, but it's a patent on a plant instead of a gadget of some kind. We have a system where they're registered, the variety's fully documented and its features are described and that sort of thing, and provided it's an original breed, it goes through quite a testing period just to make sure it's genetically different from other varieties. And if it's granted, protection's given for 20 years, so long as the registration requirements are kept up and an annual fee's paid. Protection's given for up to 20 years on that variety. And by protection, I mean that the owner of the variety, in this case here the MCT1 that you see in front of you, the owner of the variety has the right to commercialise that variety. So they get to say who can propagate it, who can breed it, who can on-sell it to other people, that kind of thing. So it establishes a legal right. And then the rest of it just folds into the normal legal system. There's contractual agreements, which are just standard law of contract. You can issue a contract with the protection of plant breeders' rights saying you won't use this to make your own trees. You'll always pay a royalty per tree, etc. Whatever conditions go into sort of contractual terms. It's the plant breeders' rights that make those contracts enforceable by having that legal existence of rights. So, which varieties have plant breeders' rights? Fewer than you would think. Australia has many varieties of macadamia. There are some that, obviously are quite old and predate the whole plant breeders' rights stuff. But I did a search and it was interesting what I found. A4, which is this tree in front of you, flowering like crazy, which A4s do. A4 was the first, along with A16, to get plant breeders' rights. Now, those rights have expired. Once they've expired, anyone can breed with them, reproduce them, doesn't matter. No need to pay any royalty. The only one of the other A varieties bred in Australia that actually succeeded in getting plant breeders' rights was the A38. But for some reason that was terminated before the 20 years was up. Don't know why, whether it was a clerical error on behalf of the owners or they just decided it wasn't worth it anymore, but they gave it up in the early 2000s, and therefore it no longer has any protection as well. The current varieties that have protection are the MCT1, which I just showed you, and the 4 new CSIRO based varieties, G, J, R and P. And theirs is provisional. The MCT1 is the only fully granted rights at the moment, but the provisional ones do have just about the same legal protection, while the finalities of the application are sort of worked through and established as plant breeders' rights. Now, what does that mean for growers? Well, when plant breeders' rights exist, the owners of those rights can then use that to license nurseries or others to produce and sub-license the right to produce trees of that variety. It's controlled by usually by royalty. In our case, the royalty is usually $4 or $5 a tree. I think it's $5 in respect of MCT1. And they can actually sort of contract that out to another organisation, a rights organisation. Funnily enough, G, J, R and P are managed by the Queensland Strawberry Growers Association. Why? I don't know. I guess they're good at handling rights for things, but they handle the rights for those those varieties. And what they'll do is go into contracts with nurseries like Tim Hills's nursery, you've seen on the macadamia show, where he has contracted with them saying, look, you can breed these trees and sell them to growers, only to growers, unfortunately not to the general public, on condition that you sign the growers up to a non-propagation agreement. And that's a contract. It's just a plain contract under contract law, which says that the grower, in accepting these trees, will only use them to grow macadamias, and they won't use them to then sort of graft and develop their own trees. Funnily enough, there's exceptions to the law, and that includes making a new variety. So you could use MCT1 as a breeding partner to make a new variety of tree altogether, and that's legally okay. But using MCT1 to reproduce more MCT1s and fill an orchard full of trees you haven't paid royalties for, that's not on, and that's what the legislation stops. So there's the protection of the plant breeders' rights. The agreement for MCT1 is actually quite draconian. It provides that, you know, any grower buying these MCT1 trees and signs the agreement is signing an agreement to say if you ever sell your farm, you have to sign up the purchaser of the farm to a non-propagation agreement, the same way as if they were buying the trees themselves for the first time. So that, you know, it prevents the situation where you plant MCT1s, you then sell the farm, and then the new farm owner, well, he's not bound by any contract. He could then start, you know, using the MCT1s to breed his own trees and not pay royalties. Now, there's some specific provisions, including, you know, you could get your trees bulldozed if you don't agree to those terms. Now, I doubt that will ever happen somehow, but the legal right is there, and of course it's always a danger if you flout the rules. But, there you are. Now, we saw in the macadamia show when we visited Tim Hills's nursery that there were a whole shipment of MCT1s that the customer, on seeing this non-propagation agreement, rejected and then said, I don't want to have that legal red tape hanging over my property. I'll do something else. And so that does beg the question, you know, is it really worth growing these protected varieties while their protection remains current? And I suppose there's two considerations. One is, look, the people who spend the money and the time breeding these macadamias for you really deserve some compensation. You know, and I say that with a little bit of hypocrisy because Australia inherited all these Hawaiian varieties like these 660s here, didn't pay a cent for them. And, effectively they're funded by the University of Hawaii and then the federal government of the United States. And so all their intellectual property came over to Australia and the rest of the world for free. And we've been taking advantage of it ever since. But, you know, in Australia, where they've spent a lot of time making these new varieties, it is fair, just like with any patent, to reimburse the costs of making these trees. And the legal reason being, of course, is it's an incentive for people to make new and better varieties of macadamia trees so that we can all benefit from down the track. And the protection for 20 years is just part of that bargain. You know, they get protection for 20 years, they get the right to commercialise it for 20 years. After that, well, you know, they've had enough of a go at people's pockets, and the protection lapses. Of course, the other consideration is, well, are these new protected varieties better anyway than these free ones that we got from Hawaii? And Garth did a discussion of that in the Australian Macadamia channel, where he said, well, look, you know, there's a lot of these new varieties that are only just as good as the Hawaiians that you've got before. And the thorn in the side when it comes to trialling these varieties is the variety 816, which under ideal conditions produces enormous amounts of kernel and is very hard for any other variety to beat. And the problem with 816 is that it's susceptible to husk spot. It's very susceptible to root diseases. And the older it gets, the more finicky and sort of prima donna-ish it gets. So while it's capable of those fantastic numbers, in practice people aren't planting it anymore because of those very problems. So other than that, though, sure, the Hawaiians still do well, and people are still planting 741s and 344s and even 246s for pollination, and I'm going to be getting some 783s, which are not under any sort of royalty system at all, for pollinating my variety R's. So there's a mix for you. Over here it looks like we've got a mix even in the one tree. What we've got here is a 660, and you can see the flowers of the 660 up there. But then you've got this branch here beneath the graft, which is clearly an old bush nut of some kind, and it's putting out these big pink flowers, masses of them. They look great, but they don't generally turn into nuts, and I suspect when I come to do some skirting, that branch will be for the chop, even though it's full of flowers. Good for cross-pollination, though, on the one tree. But yeah, you know, it's not an automatically foregone conclusion that the plant breeders' rights ones, which cost more, always deliver the best result. You're better off mixing some varieties with others, and as Garth recommended himself, it's pretty good to hedge your bets. So if you're planting a bunch of blocks, maybe plant one with a tried and tested variety, and another with one of the new varieties, to see how you go. Also bear in mind that there are new varieties being made even now, still being tested, and it'll be a while, they say about 2024, before we start seeing them. On the other end of the scale, unfortunately, we've got some new A varieties, particularly the A376, which I think has some absolute rock star potential. But we can't access them because the owner of that variety has not gone and done his paperwork and got them registered yet. And they were promised to the industry in 2020, but we still don't have them. And David Bell, if you're watching this, please, I want to plant the A376 and sing its praises for you. But you need to get those things registered. Get them some PBRs and then get them out to nurseries. I will happily pay your royalty because you deserve to be paid for your inventions. Okay, well, enough of a rant from me, enough legal discussion. If you have any other questions on plant breeders' rights, it's probably best that you post them in the comments below, because if I did try and do a video answering all the questions about plant breeders' rights, you would have turned off long before now. It's a pretty dry topic, but for the future of our industry, a pretty important one, because it's the incentive for our plant breeders to give us new varieties and help us do better than ever before. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.